Okay, so we have our two fantastic keynote speakers. We've had some questions that have come in from all of you over the course of the day. We'll start with the ones we have on screen, and then we will do a roaming mic in the audience. So if something comes to mind, hold that thought. We will get to you shortly. So I thought I would start with something simple to warm you up for some spicy questions. What has been your favorite insight or learning from today?
I can start. Can you hear me? Yep. No, is it working now? Okay. There was an amazing panel downstairs around platform and all these ideas around platform as a product. Amazing panelists, so it was really good. And yeah, one of the insights was that if you're trying to build a new platform and sort of thinnest viable platform, if you like, in the team topologies language, you shouldn't try to build a platform that does a lot of things in a very minimal way, because that's not where your customers or internal teams, that's not what they're expecting, right? Because it's not a greenfield, your internal engineering platform. So you need to build enough that provides value to your internal teams, right? And then go from there.
Lovely. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so for me, it was in Dan's talk where he basically said that there's no evidence that storming, forming, norming, performing actually is true. And I thought, God, I've really got, first of all, I've put it in my book. And secondly, I really have to go and find out more about this. So yeah, that's really one for me to follow up on.
Amazing. So while we're with you, Sarah, there's one that's come in directly for you. It says, what was the biggest learning or takeaway from leading the engineering enablement at the Financial Times?
Just an easy question. So I think it was realizing that how important actually the relationships that we had with other teams was. So I spent a lot of time making sure that I had a good personal relationship with every other tech director, because actually you're going to want them to do things. They're going to want you to do things. You have to build that relationship. And I invested in that. So it's not even particularly a technical thing. It's basically you have to build the connections so that you can achieve what you want to achieve. Related to that, we actually did a bit of coaching where they asked us a bunch of questions to find out our conflict style. So how do we deal with conflict? And it was absolutely fascinating to find out which of my colleagues wanted their own way regardless, which people were good at collaborating. And I thought I would be, oh yeah, I'm totally collaboration. It turns out I'm a horse trader. It's like, I'll do a thing for you if you do a thing for me. And it was a great insight.
Lovely. So Manuel, this is probably one for you. In the 5 years since Team Topologies has been out, I believe you published in 2019, what do you think about the ideas that have evolved for yourself since then? And could you comment on anything new you'd like to add?
For sure. So first of all, these 5 years have been a whirlwind. A lot of the success was not really planned or expected. The things that really excite me around this team topologies ecosystem is seeing how the ideas are being combined with other approaches. Like we had, for example, Susan Kaiser talking today about how do you combine team topologies with worldly mapping or domain-driven design. So I really believe like there's exponential value in terms of figuring out how this team topologies combine with these other approaches that you're going to need around strategy, team building, design, all these other aspects you're going to have to consider for fast flow, right? So it's really great when people appreciate team topologies and that might be their starting point, but then you're going to need to adopt some other approaches as well, right? So I really think the work of all the people who are combining, I can think of dynamic reteaming as well, and so the talk from Dan North was also great on how to combine these things. That's really where there's a lot of potential. And then the other thing I'm excited about is what I talked this morning. When we look at really the principles of fast flow and some of the patterns, can this be applied outside of engineering and then even outside of tech companies, right?
Amazing. So we have a little bit of a long question here, but it is directed towards both of you and some of the topics that you touched on in your talk. So both Manuel and Sarah touched a little bit on leadership. not being afraid of the sunk cost fallacy and leadership as a platform. If you look at how organizations currently place leadership in an organizational structure, what do you think the next iteration of that would look like? Micro enterprises? Leadership as a service? Please feel free to comment.
Another easy one. I'm not sure I'm in a position to say this is how it's going to look like. I like the idea of micro enterprises. I also love the work of John Smart and others on this idea of nested value streams, if you're familiar with that, because I think that has a strong connection with leadership. If we organize our companies to be aligned to the actual value streams, then maybe leadership changes a bit, because if you have people working together on the same value stream, then maybe leadership becomes less what we still see today, which is very much at a lot of team level and middle management in place to sort of figure out what should the teams be working on and so on. If you're more aligned to the value streams, then the teams should be able to make better decisions, and you can have things like leadership as a platform that I was talking this morning. I think implicitly you need to be to some extent organized around value streams and have clarity on your value streams before you can adopt this sort of leadership as a platform or as a service type of approach.
Sarah, I'd love to hear your views.
So I think there's a vast number of organizations who are still working in a very hierarchical leadership style, where people don't really want to give up their power or their people. The idea that you couldn't move people to the work because that would mean I have fewer people reporting into me. But I think that actually the idea of the type of culture you have in your organization and starting to appreciate that bureaucratic organization is not going to help you is a big change, and that most people haven't quite got there. We probably in this room are people who understand it more. When I worked at the FT, we already had quite a separate set of groups. So the tech directors, I felt like I was a mini CTO anyway. So actually we did work quite independently, and there's some pain in that. You end up with a lot of people repeating the same things in different parts of the organization, or actually you don't know how to do something because it's different for you now in this group than in the previous group. So it's a challenge to try and do it. And you have to work out how you fit your way of working into an organization that's probably got one way of thinking that you do assessing people. You've got a yearly review for everybody across the organization. You can be as independent as you want. You have to be part of that.
As a follow-up then, so just commenting on something you've said, if you could go back and talk to the younger version of yourself, with the knowledge you have now, what would the advice be when you were operating independently in that CTO style identification that you've just mentioned?
I mean, I enjoyed it. To be honest, it's a perfect job. Like, actually, as a tech director, you can just get on with things. It's great. I think I should have probably pushed a bit more on trying to get more standardization across the organization, because we still had a lot of things that cost us because everyone was doing it independently. It's very hard to have that discussion and win people over, because people think of autonomy as complete independence. It's freedom to do stuff. And it's hard to sell it as, actually, it's autonomy within some kind of framework.
Absolutely, great answer. So we'll take it back to an easy one before we ramp it up again shortly afterwards. What is the biggest blocker to flow that you've seen?
I don't know if I can quantify the biggest, but I do see some new blockers, partially or accidentally stemming from team topologies in a way. So I should do a talk about that. So some of the new things that show up sometimes is, for example, using team cognitive load as the reason why we cannot do certain things. And so that's a sort of very naive view of team cognitive load, which is quite complex, as we saw today in the talk from Aleix and Laura earlier today. There are many factors influencing team cognitive load. And so it's not meant to be something they say, well, we cannot learn new things or we cannot work on new domains or new services because that's too much cognitive load. What we need to find is a balance, right? If we need to learn things, if we need to have more skills in the team, or we need to work on some new domains, that is aligned to the business value, then let's look at if this is overloading the team, what are the things we actually can address and reduce, right? So we need to have more in-depth understanding of what is team cognitive load, what are the drivers. So that's a lot of the work we've done in the last 2-3 years as well, trying to understand at the more fine-grained level what drives cognitive load in teams. So that is one of the blockers. I would say another one we still see very often from some of our customer leads asking, well, we need to have a reorg in 3 months and it should be team topologies compliant or whatever you want to call it, which is like, I think you're missing the point of fast flow and sort of this need to continuously evolve the organization, right? And address what's the next challenge, where's the next blocker to flow within the organization that we can address, which might mean we need some different types of teams, or it might mean something else that we need to do to address that blocker. So yeah, some of those are quite frequent.
Absolutely, thank you. Sarah, what about your views?
So, well, I think it's interesting. So generally speaking, whenever I talk to a client organization, it all comes down to you can't release your code quickly. I know it sounds really basic, but it's like basic. Almost always, you start by saying you don't have the ability to make a change and take it through to production. And that stops everything else because you're constantly waiting. There's a lot of handoffs. But I think that the thing that's quite related to that, or that stops you from getting better, is often there's a sense that I need to ask someone for permission to do this thing. And they have no idea who they would ask for permission, but we can't just go and do it. And the number of times you have people saying, well, security wouldn't let us do that, legal wouldn't let us do it, and no one's actually asked security or legal or compliance. They haven't asked, how could we do this in a different way that didn't involve a manual process? They've just assumed that it's impossible and that these teams are not someone you can talk to solve a problem.
Absolutely. Nice, succinct answer. Thank you. So we have a long one here from Tolly. I did ask him to make this a little bit shorter. It's still rather long, so please bear with me. One of the fundamental axioms of team topologies is that we have stable, long-lived teams aligned to a value stream. How do you balance the benefits of this versus the challenges? So he's mentioned rigidity of structure and having to define the boundaries and domains.
It's a fair question. It's a good question. So when we talk about long-lived teams, we don't mean that they're fully static, first of all, right? It's not like this exact group of people can never change. And so approaches like dynamic reteaming are interesting because they provide some proven patterns of how can we reorganize in a way that keeps sort of the social aspects of people changing teams, and now you're working with other people. That has an impact, right, on the how effective people are when they're changing teams and changing domains and etc. But for sure, there are many situations where that's going to have to happen. What we meant in team topologies is more around there has to be. I think, Sarah, you were mentioning this in your keynote. There has to be ownership or stewardship of all the services that we provide, right, that support the business or that generate revenue and so on. And so you sort of need to keep the teams as a unit, even if though the composition of the team changes over time. And in some cases, a more extreme, if you like, sometimes you're going to have to disband teams, maybe because they were working in some domain that now is not relevant anymore for the business. But those are more the exceptions, right? So usually, if we keep the team stable and they change over time, people will leave, people will join, but we get to that ability to keep the team performing well and keep the ownership or the stewardship of the services that typically that they build or that they have taken responsibility of.
Lovely.
I think you just want to avoid that a team comes together for a project, builds a thing, and then throws it at another team. And because that's really difficult, it's very rarely a good handover. Tend to end up that the other team doesn't feel that they're really valued. They're just like the maintenance team. So I used to work in that way. I didn't like it. I think that if a service is live, some team should own it, but it won't be the same team. And people change companies. You're allowed to leave the company and go somewhere else. You're allowed to leave the team and go somewhere else. And also, actually, if you have the same number of people in a team for a particular product over a long period of time, that's probably a bad sign, because you don't have the same amount of work that you need to be doing. You may have something else that you could be doing in the organization. And actually, a lot of times you don't have the conversation about should we move people to this other area because it's going to upset people's hierarchy, like going back to one of my earlier answers. So actually, you should be changing teams. You should be having fewer people or moving someone onto a new problem. But the services that you build are still there, and they still need to have someone caring about them.
Absolutely. It's almost like we're talking about DevOps still 10 years later. So on that, actually, there's been a question that's come in around team topologies and where you see it going into the future. But what's more interesting in the wording of this question is they've asked whether you're worried that it's going to turn into what they've called a weasel word, like agile. So given that we're talking here about DevOps, and that maybe is not talked about as much, although I'm a huge advocate and I think it's very valuable, do you have any of those concerns around team topologies?
I mean, for me, it's almost a given that there's these cycles. If you look at Agile and DevOps, there's these cycles, and team topologies is on a cycle like that as well. Obviously, what I would like is that even maybe 10, 20 years from now, we still can talk about team topologies, and we still remember what are the principles. Why are we talking about fast flow? Aligning to streams and having teams with more purpose and more sort of long-lived, and with not having project teams all the time. But I do expect that we're on this cycle where there will be some disillusionment because the way the ideas have been implemented didn't work out for certain organizations. So that's sort of to be expected. And I had a conversation earlier today where we were talking about, well, maybe the idea of fast flow also at some point might get misinterpreted, or there will be more sort of backlash. And so it's really, if we look at it from an industry perspective, I think we're always moving forward with these new approaches. And then there's some corruption, if you like, of the ideas over time, and that sort of has to be expected. But personally, as you've seen probably in the keynote, I'm really interested in how can these ideas of fast flow and what are the patterns in team topologies that can be applied more broadly. So I think there's still a long path to how do we get these ideas across the whole organization outside of technology, that we hopefully will see that happening more.
Absolutely. And Sarah, would you like to comment?
That's more one for someone who wrote the book.
Okay, well, this next one possibly is also one for somebody that wrote the book. So we're going to turn up the spice level a little with this one. So this question came in a few flavors. I will summarize succinctly. What do you feel about the backlash that team topologies has been receiving on LinkedIn as of late?
I guess that's for me as well. So it's actually funny. I don't know if Matthew is here, but he tends to answer more, and kind of.
We had him last year. We'd love to hear your views. So.
No, I mean, like I said, on one hand, is to be expected because there will be misinterpretations. There will be arguments, valid arguments in terms of, okay, well, actually, this. Some of these ideas don't work as well in this context, or any sort of disagreements that are healthy and are helping us as a whole sort of move forward, understand better. some of the ideas in team topologies, that's good, right? So I think some of the messages around, well, if someone's saying team topologies is wrong, then I don't think that's a very healthy discussion in my point of view, because the starting point is sort of not in the right place. If we have a discussion about, well, let's say team cognitive load as defined in the book is too broad and it doesn't help us kind of make better decisions, I would say I agree with that. And so everything that comes after the book that can help us sort of clarify and address some holes in the ideas or things that were not totally clear, that's, for me, is always welcome if the starting point is helpful, because at least for me, saying, it's the same as saying Agile is wrong or DevOps is wrong doesn't make sense. There's a lot within those approaches, and yeah, that's how I see it.
Absolutely. I think that was a perfectly good answer. No one needs to be stressed about that. So, Sarah, do you have any advice for people that are implementing team topologies, and they've said it could be specific or more broad based on your experience?
I feel like often people say, I want to do team topologies, and actually there's more fundamental things to think about first. So it's think about where your problems actually are and try and focus on those. And it will come out of that you may need to set up different types of team. But I think it's worrying for me if someone says, I want to do team topologies, because you're not saying, what's your problem that you're trying to address right now? So to them, the question is, why have you brought me in as a consultant? Well, it's because you're basically thinking that you're taking forever to get changes out, and you're spending 80% of your time doing manual toil. Well, let's focus on that, and let's see how, by trying to fix that, we can identify that we need a platform team, or that there's some expertise missing, and we could set up an enabling team and get that going. Because often you're working also with stakeholders outside technology who really, they're not that interested in the terminology, but you can sell them on the benefit of what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. So we've got about 7.5 minutes left. So I just wanted to take a checkpoint and see if there was anyone in the audience that had a question they'd like to take live. By show of hands, if you'd like to ask a question. That's a no. Well, I do have more to ask, so that's okay. If you change your minds, just give me a little wave at the back. So this question here is talking more about the case studies and what you've seen in industry with people using team topologies. Have any of these case studies been unexpected? And if so, say more about why that is.
I would say for sure. Some of the case studies that came up early after the book was published, so in the first couple of years, as you would expect, coming from smaller organizations that have, once you have buy-in from leadership, tends to be, easier or faster to adopt some of the ideas in team topologies. So I remember, for example, with Pure Gym, which people living in London very familiar with this chain of gyms, right? When that story came up, that was through Rich Allen, who is now one of the core team members. You can get up if you want. So, yeah. That story was amazing. What surprised me in that was how they intentionally made time to sort of figure out the unknowns, right? Didn't know exactly what sort of platforms they were going to need. They didn't know exactly, this mobile team, is it going to be an enabling team now or platform, etc. And they didn't try to have all the answers in advance. They were like, let's set ourselves up in this way and intentionally spend a couple of months figuring out how well does this work or not, what are the things that we're going to have to adjust. So this idea of we're going to have several iterations and sort of continuous evolution of the teams, of the interactions between them to figure out how do we get to a better state of faster flow. And so that intentionality of we don't expect, obviously if we have this period of time where we're doing a lot of discovery in terms of interactions and the new teams. We don't expect we'll be able to deliver a lot of changes to the actual products, but that's okay because we know we need to figure this out. That was really interesting. And then there was another early one from USwitch, which also familiar to the people living in the UK, where was interesting because that unknown to us, they had basically for a number of years applied the ideas of streamlined teams and teams with a lot of autonomy to be able to go fast and discover quickly what they needed to do. And then they faced the problems of high cognitive load on those teams, and then they introduced a platform. So it was like, if we had that when we were writing the book, that would have been like the perfect example of applying some of the principles and ideas in the book.
Beauty of hindsight. So someone has just posted a question, which is great because I had run out. You've both written really successful books. What advice would you give to someone looking to write a book for the first time? And we've got about 4 minutes, so perhaps you can split this one.
I loved writing a book, but I don't know how anyone does it and actually has a job at the same time. I quit my job and wrote the book. My advice would be work out the time of day that you actually are good at writing and good at editing. I read loads of advice that said get up and start writing first thing. Like that's what you should do before you check your email. And it turns out that I'm really good at writing stuff between 4 and 7 in the evening. So I could just sit there from the beginning and not get anywhere and separate writing and editing. So literally just write stuff, and every time you get to a place where you go, I don't know this, just write to do, go and read this book or whatever, and just keep going and then edit it. And you should expect to edit a huge amount. And I literally spent 3 months going through the feedback from my tech reviewers, which was excellent feedback, and rewriting huge amounts of the book. It's a much better book as a result, but you don't get it right. Someone reading it and saying, this didn't make sense to me, it didn't flow, you should split this chapter. Did you think about mentioning this topic, where I had to go and read a book? so yeah, it's that's my advice.
Amazing. Manuel, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that, and I feel like I went through similar pains. I'm trying to write, but nothing is coming up, and so everyone is different. So you're going to have different approach to writing. Maybe some people like to write a bit every day. Other people are like, today's the day that I have all the inspiration. So just accounting for that as well when you're sort of planning your time and how and when are you going to write the book. And then for us in particular, it was super helpful to have a publisher with really good editors that if you would have read the first draft of the book, it was a lot more sort of tedious and more academic. And so they made us change a lot of sort of in terms of the narrative and how they introduce ideas and so on. That make the book a lot better. So do believe in your editors if they tell you you need to do some drastic changes, because the end result tends to be much better because they're helping you from the point of view of the reader, obviously, from the point of view of telling a story. So if you can have really good editors, that's awesome, and reviews from other people that you really trust their judgment and that will be honest with you and brutal if possible, and telling you, I didn't understand this, this doesn't make sense, etc. And then it depends a bit. For me, it was very helpful to have this basically 9-month process to get the book published from the first draft, because it helped me sort of get into a schedule and know when I had to dedicate time to do the editing or the next revision, etc. Other people prefer to kind of self-publish or write the book first and then improve bit by bit. So it depends, and I would say also depends a bit on what are you trying to achieve with writing a book. For some people, it's just, I want to get my ideas out, I want to share with the world, and other people might be, I want to have something that I can give my customers, or I don't care as much with the reach. or you might want to actually have a book that's successful and you want to build a business around it. So having that understanding can help also with your decision on, okay, do I self-publish? I will have less reach, but that's okay with me, or do I want to go to a publisher and try to reach a bigger audience?
Amazing. We are 14 seconds over time, so I'm going to wrap there. Would you all give me a big round of applause for our two keynote speakers?